Anyone who'd like to ask a question, feel free.
Can I ask a question? It seems to me that game theory is played by politicians all the time in every country. We play game theory constantly in Australian politics. You can often see it emerging. But we're not as successful, or no one is as successful as Castro was. Was it just game theory, or was it game theory played by an absolutely ruthless person who ensured that his game played out according to his theory?
Yes, it was that. Fidel Castro has a very, if you did a clinical analysis of him, he has a very logical mind. Logic is a very strong point with him. It's been said of Fidel Castro that he has headlights that sees into the future. He often anticipates what's going to happen before it happens, which helps explain why he's been able to hold on to power. For example, there was a General Arnaldo Ochoa, who was a very popular Cuban general. There was no evidence whatsoever that he ever plotted against Castro, but because Castro feared that Gorbachev would try and use Ochoa as a reformist against him, Castro had him executed. Now, there's no trumped-up charges of drug smuggling. Now, there's no evidence that Ochoa did that, but Castro could see ahead before and saw a problem that could potentially emerge and cut off at the pass. So not only does he do that with the future, but he's always done that with the future. He's always been able to anticipate what's going to happen in the future and made according arrangements. He even foresaw the fall of the Berlin Wall because he could see that the liberalisation measures that Gorbachev would bring an end to the Soviet Union. He foresaw that. And time and again, predictions that he's made have been borne out by subsequent events. So yes, he was an absolutely ruthless figure, and the fact that he was able to establish a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship, 90 miles off the coast of the United States, is undoubtedly due to Fidel Castro's diabolical genius. Yes.
A question that would flow from that is that people who are diabolical geniuses, fortunately for the rest of mankind, are very rare. Because if we had too many of them around, we'd all just be slaves. So if it's a rare event to have a diabolical genius like that, does that actually give us greater hope that with his demise, Raul Castro and all of the cohort who surrounded Castro simply won't have the capacity to maintain the system that Fidel Castro invented and maintained?
That's an interesting question. If you look at Cuban communists, they're trained, and they've either intuitively or by osmosis, or by the training they've received, they understand political strategy. If you look at countries such as Nicaragua, Angola and Mozambique, even though they're not Marxist-Leninist, because they've been Cuban trained, the ruling parties are still in power, despite there being multi-party systems in place. And even in East Timor, you might have seen that Cuban operatives understand power, they understand the dynamics of power, and so on. So I don't think that they'll give way voluntarily, and I think they're shrewd enough to manipulate diplomatic relations and economic ties with the United States to perpetuate themselves in power. That's what I fear. So I don't think it will be the case that after the Castro brothers die, that it'll necessarily be next year in Havana. Unfortunately, I wish it would be otherwise. Yeah, yes.
David, when do you think Castro became a communist?
I think he always was. Actually, it was said of Fidel Castro that he's actually the world's last communist, but he's not even a communist. When he was at primary school, he was fascinated with Primo de Rivera. So in the 1940s, he saw, and I'm sure that he regards Marxist-Leninism as a vehicle to perpetuate his rule. Had Nazi Germany, for example, won World War II, I have no doubt that, and fascism remained a viable ideology, I have no doubt that Fidel Castro would have been a fascist. But the point of the matter is he uses Marxism-Leninism as his vehicle because since an early age he's always been a budding totalitarian. It's John and then the other John. Sorry, John Marlon and then the other John.
Well, if I can make just one point before I ask the question. You gave a fairly extensive review of Cuban history without any real reference to the media, or the press as it used to be called once. And I'm wondering what role the press played. The other question is, how did Joe Slovo's game plan differ from Fidel Castro's?
Well, firstly, with regard to the press in Cuba, and it wasn't censored under Fulgencio Batista. The press in Cuba was freewheeling, and when Castro was imprisoned, there was actually a campaign, newspaper editorials, calling for Fidel Castro's release from prison. So it was actually a free press that in part secured Castro's release from prison in 1955. And it was also, as I said with Herbert Matthews, the publicity that the New York Times and the Washington Post gave to Castro helped propel him to power. So the press, a free press, played a very important role in him coming to power. And so today in Cuba there is no free press. There is a government newspaper, Communist Party newspaper called Granma. There's also one thing I think it's called Hoy. But there are no semi-start news spreadsheets, or even, and Cubans still don't have, despite media reports, still don't have access to the internet. So, so the press, Fidel Castro benefited from a free press, and having benefited from a free press, made sure that Cubans don't have access to a free press. And with regard to Joe Slovo, with regard, if you look at Fulgencio Batista, falling from power, a lot of it's fortuna, it's happenstance. If something else had gone the other way, maybe Castro might not have been able to pull off what he pulled off. With regard to Joe Slovo, the fact that he was thwarted in almost instigating a right-wing military coup to in turn lead to revolution was due to the nimble-mindedness of the then Foreign Minister, Pik Botha. And I also would like to say with regard to South Africa, I know that Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk deservedly in 1993 were given the Nobel Peace Prize. But I also think that a recipient of the Peace Prize for South Africa should have been the French President Francois Mitterrand. Francois Mitterrand was a radish. He was red on the outside and white on the inside. And he was actually a shrewd anti-communist. And he was the man who advised F.W. de Klerk and liaised with Mandela to undermine the Communist Party within the ANC. So, and I'm sure that Pik Botha had ties with Francois Mitterrand during that period. So unfortunately in Cuba in the 1950s and 1940s, there was no equivalent of a Francois Mitterrand or a Pik Botha. To answer your question. Yes, John?
Mine's question surrounds the curious situation that our last communist dictator also happens to be in the top 100 richest people. And in his need to find somewhere away from crime, do you think our Prime Minister and our beloved security services who can find poor Tamils security threats to Australia because they fought against people we supply with weapons and ships to prevent them reaching Australia in spite of their almost crucifixion? I'm just wondering if ASIS and ASIO would find Raul Castro and Fidel suitable immigrants, provided they brought their money to Australia.
I would say, this might be a controversial belief on my part, but I believe that if a dictator voluntarily gives up power, that he or she should be immune from prosecution. I therefore think it was wrong for General Augusto Pinochet in Chile to have been persecuted when he went to Britain, because he passed the Rubicon of giving up power voluntarily. So as much as I despise the Castro brothers, I think if they were to give up power voluntarily, and they wouldn't ever, they shouldn't be prosecuted. Certainly moves should be made to track down their wealth and recuperate it. But if they were to give up power voluntarily, and they couldn't stay on in Cuba if they did, I think they should be granted asylum in another country and left alone. Yes?
Thanks, David. I knew a little bit about Cuba. I now know 10 times as much as I knew before, which is very good. It's a fascinating country. And I mean, it's kind of trendy Cuban music and all the rest of it, but I've resolved I won't visit Cuba until it's a democratic country, but nevertheless I'd love to go there. You mentioned Granma, the Cuban Communist newspaper. I'm going to ask a question, but I'll just say in passing, my brother-in-law made the mistake of saying to me 20 years ago he wanted to learn Spanish. The Moscow Socialist Party had an office down in Elizabeth Street. I popped in, and for something like $5 or $10, I bought a year's subscription to Granma for my brother-in-law, and they were amazed that someone, an Australian, came in and wanted a subscription to a Cuban communist in Spanish. My brother-in-law then threatened to divorce my sister if I renewed the subscription. Because for a year he had this communist Cuban rubbish turning up in his letterbox. Anyway, it was a very good deal. Listening to your comments on Cuba, sadly I thought of South Vietnam, and I thought you mentioned a couple of times the US's misguided interventions in a country, and I just wonder, at the very end, I wonder in 58 and 59 whether the US really knew what they were doing, and then they tried perhaps to make up for it with the half-hearted Bay of Pigs. But, and I'm thinking of someone that we all used to read, 20 years ago in his weekly columns, that the US is not always the best ally, and you can't always count on them. And this is kind of a sad story of that.
Oh, I'd say the American ambassador to Cuba between 1957 and 1958 was Earl Smith. And Earl Smith actually sent reports to the State Department that Fidel Castro was a communist. And Earl Smith later wrote a book called On the Fourth Floor. And he wrote about how on the fourth floor of the State Department there were a group of pro-Castro State Department officials who accepted because of what Castro, he came across as a very romantic figure, and people wanted to believe that he was some sort of folk hero. So the fantasy is something that took hold, because Castro, even though I don't like him, if you've seen him interviewed on television, he's an appealing personality. He's a pure psychopath. He comes across as very likable. And Earl Smith was later blamed for losing Cuba because he stuck by Batista, but in actual fact he'd warned the Eisenhower administration not to impose an arms embargo, and there was clear evidence that Castro was liaising with the Communist Party, and there was clear evidence that even then he was executing even his own supporters, many of whom were anti-communist. So it was already there, and I think the blind of those who just aren't prepared to see. With regard to the United States, I think the United States has improved a great deal. I think they've shown a lot more sophistication. I know people say the situation in Iraq is abysmal, but for example, the spiritual leader of Iraq Shia Muslims, Ayatollah Ali Sistani, is actually pro-American, and has actually supported links with the Sunnis and the Kurds and so on. But if you read the media today, you think that the Americans messed up really badly in Iraq. But Iraq is actually, the Americans actually, to their credit, stuck to it in Iraq. So I think there's been a growing sophistication, particularly on the part of neoconservatives, neocons, when it comes to foreign policy. So yes, mistakes have been made, and I know that President Chiu of South Vietnam said when he was denied asylum in the United States that it's easier to be an enemy of the United States than a friend. That may have been the case, but I think the United States has learned a lot, particularly since Vietnam. Yes.
David, you described Cuba exporting the techniques of seeking and maintaining power. Or could you call this Castroism?
Yes, Castroism is basically Castro, I think, has honed Marxist-Leninism. He, for example, if you look at groups such as Resistance in Australia, what they often do is they try and provoke an incident with the police and then generate a campaign around that incident. And that's what Fidel Castro did in the 1950s. After Fulgencio Batista's return to power, he went out of his way to try and goad the police for there to be an incident. And Batista actually ordered maximum restraint on the part of the police force, because Batista himself had once been a revolutionary, so he understood how that game was played. But yes, Castroism is not so much an ideology, but it is a technique of how to undermine the established order, and then having done so, perpetuate yourself in power indefinitely.
Now, in Cuba itself, would Castroism be played by an elite small group of people who continue to do this, or is it a more socially wide movement in Cuba itself?
Cuba's a closed society, so I don't know, but I do think that to be in the upper echelons of the Cuban leadership, you would have to be indoctrinated with their strategic approach to leadership. They understand the Cuban leadership, in contrast to the leadership in Eastern Europe, they understand power, they understand how to maintain power.
But what I mean is, if it's confined to a smaller and smaller group of controlling people, the mass of the people in Cuba, do they have the opportunity to be more independently minded?
I think what's happened in Cuba is that the government's made a pact with the people. If you ever, I'll never go to Cuba, of course, but if people have gone there, say that the Cubans have a real joie de vivre when it comes to life. And basically, if you've ever read the book 1984 with Orwell and the character Julia, and in that book, Julia tries to manifest her dissent from the ruling INSOC party by having illicit sex and not being controlled by the state. And what the Castro regime has basically done is it said to the Cuban people, you can have parties on the street and so on, and partake in partying and so on, in return for us not trying to regulate every part of your life and tell you what to do and how you live your lives. You don't challenge us politically. And that seems to be the social contract that's holding at the moment.
One last one, race in Cuba, Spanish, you mentioned before the sort of, and Fidel or the Castros are in the children of a Spanish migrant, but the majority of Cubans are black?
No, I think 20 to 30% of the population is African. The majority are white, but there's also mestizo, a mixed race. Fulgencio Batista himself was mestizo. He was descended from the extinct Tiano Indians. He was also of Chinese and African descent. And Cuba actually, one of the Cuban academic based in America, he sent me an email. He read an article on Fulgencio Batista that I'd written, and he said one of the aspects that I had omitted from the article was one of the reasons that the middle class turned against Fulgencio Batista was because he was of African descent. It was for reasons of racism. So Batista certainly was an amazing person that, despite not being white, he was able to, being a mixed race, he was able to break into the top of Cuban politics.
And could race be an issue in reforming Cuba in the future?
Yeah. Well, yes, I think if you look at the Politburo and so on, a very small number are black. Again, Cuba's a closed society, so we can't tell what the dynamics are. But again, I come back to the point, I think that with a lot of people, including people, non-white people, the social contract is we'll let you party and have a good time and endure the system, so long as you don't buck the system. Castro did, when he first came to power, he did actually try and forge links with black radicals in the United States. And he also was one of the few people who understood the potential, the revolutionary potential in the Portuguese colonies. So, but when in the 1970s Cuban troops went to fight in Angola, it was found that a preponderance of Cuban African troops went into the dangerous positions. And in the 2000s, there were 2 African Cubans who tried to escape from Cuba, and in the process they shot a security guard, and they were placed on trial and executed. And Castro basically said, well, why is the world complaining about these 2 little negritas? And I think that was reflective of a racism on part of Castro's part that he's been very careful to conceal.
The American election, what will happen to US-Cuban relations after it, depending on who wins?
It's anyone's guess. I predict that if Hillary Clinton wins the presidency, and I think at the moment she will, then unfortunately, although actually Hillary Clinton is actually more of a hawk in foreign policy than what Obama is, but I think there are people within the Democratic Party, who would want to have close relations with Cuba and end the embargo. If that happens, and the US Congress has to lift the embargo, I would predict that Cuba would adopt a market socialist model similar to China and Vietnam, and that the communist regime, unfortunately, would take advantage of that to perpetuate themselves in power, and that such an opening wouldn't lead to democracy. If, on the other hand, a Republican wins, and by the way, I don't really classify Donald Trump as a Republican, but rather a Clinton plant. But on that basis, the embargo would be maintained. And I like to say that even though Marco Rubio's parents were anti-Batista, it was a tribute to Roberto de Aragon, the man that Batista wanted one day to become president. But he helped set the scene for Marco Rubio to have a base that he now has to run for president of Cuba, of the United States. So I think that should point out. Yes.
Now, I'm basing the question on the fact that Cuba was a Spanish colony.
Yes.
What part, if any, did the church play in all of this? I haven't heard it mentioned.
The church wasn't very powerful, as I understand it, in Cuba before the Jesuit order was there, and they were at the forefront of ecclesiastical politics. And Castro himself went to a Jesuit school, Balian College, which he was a star graduate until he closed it down. The Jesuits were a very powerful order. Castro, after coming to power, actually reached a raison d'etre with the Catholic Church. Even though Castro is an atheist, and as I understand it, Roy Orr's actually supposed to have converted to Catholicism. I don't know if that's true. The regime in Cuba understands politics really well. And even though they had clamped down on religious dissent in Cuba, and they particularly persecuted Jehovah's Witnesses, the regime actually took note of what was happening in other countries such as Brazil to help perpetuate revolutionary theology. So even though, and it's said that, I don't know if this is true, that over half the population of Cuba is secular, but the Catholic Church before Castro came to power and during the Spanish colonial era was not powerful, and paradoxically at the moment the Catholic Church in Cuba has probably been more powerful than it's ever been. But before, and Batista himself was probably in his early life a Quaker. It was only when he went into exile because of his wife's influence that he became a practicing Catholic. And so for someone who was irreligious, such as Batista, it was relatively easy for him to come to power. So the Catholic Church wasn't a powerful institution in pre-totalitarian Cuba, and paradoxically, it's got more of a role in Cuban society than it's ever had than before.
I presume you mean power, in other words, influence, rather than power
Yes,
goes out of the barrel of a gun.
Influence in that, for example, Pope Francis has visited Havana. The Bishops' Conference have latitude to take part in public policy formation and so on. I think that the Castro regime, again, it's very shrewd. I think it sees the church may have influence, but also it's co-opting the church into supporting the regime. So, as I said, the brilliance of the Castro regime is first class. It's not to be underestimated. So anything that seems to be a concession actually, in fact, would help advance it.
David, a chance for you. I've got here, is there anything that we and like-minded Australians could learn and apply here in Australia in game theory and the lessons of Cuban history and Castroism?
I think it's not to be suckered, it's not to be taken in. I mean, oftentimes, if you look at university students, how many of them a socialist alternative has nothing to do with Cuba, for example, but how many young people in universities and academic